location of the cemetery so that now the entrance faces Congress Street. Then they started, the African burial ground was in the front of the cemetery.
Right.
And then they started burying people from the African diaspora, once again in the far back corner of the cemetery. So segregated even to death. But yeah, one of the people I work with does an excellent guided tour of the Eastern Cemetery. It talks about people from the African diaspora, some of whom were enslaved, some of whom were free, who were buried there, but also talks about how the enslavers, which is really interesting because of very little known history, and Commodore Preble is buried there. He's considered to be widely the father of the American Navy. I was like, oh my gosh, it's Commodore Preble's grave, and Ron said, oh, well, you should. Sometimes I'll tell you about his enslaved Africans. Very common. Yeah, starting Wednesday, I'm going to be assuming the directorship of the Cushing Point Museum in South Portland above Wright. There's a small brick building there above Wright. Yeah. And so that's my new gig. I'll still be teaching at the Maine College of Art and Design, but just in a more limited capacity. But I've taken over the directorship of this museum in South Portland. And Colonel Ezekiel Cushing, whom the museum is named after, was a known enslaver. In fact, we even know the names of his enslaved Africans because we have his will, in which he left those enslaved Africans to his wife and son. And so, one of the things that I'm thinking about is how to kind of grapple with this information and how to make it educational learning opportunity. I suppose, as Cushing's Island. Yeah, the very same. Yeah, one of the first gentlemen involved in this West Indies trade that I'm going to share with you. Him and Symington. Symington Cove is named after, today better known as Willard Beach. That was a popular anchorage in the 1600s of this West Indies trade. It was the first place that they started trading lumber and fish to the West Indies from. So.
Yeah, I remember actually from your tour talking about that, and you sort of asked the question why they anchored there and not in Portland Harbor.
Yeah.
And my totally speculative answer is lighter. They had at that point. There wouldn't have been docks or anything in Portland.
Right.
So they would have had to essentially take cargo ashore onto a sandy beach.
Yep. Whereas they did have like some crib work at Symington Cove, which I think at low tide you can still see that went out from. He's giving you that.
Did I miss the ringing of the bells? Well, we'll use our imagination. The bells have rung. And welcome. Our interim minister, Dr. Elaine Parish, is away. I'm Angus Ferguson. Welcome to First Parish, a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Our mission is, and say it with me, to nurture the Spirit, grow in community, and help heal the world. Now, whoever you are, wherever you're from, in our historic meeting house or live streaming, whoever you love, whatever your gender identity or faith tradition, we've made a space for you for this hour. We do not believe in hell. We welcome all of those who do not believe in heaven or God, along with those who fervently do, and everybody in between and all around. As an aside, I personally believe with all my head and my heart in life before death. We trod many spiritual paths. Fair warning, most UUs believe in committees. So you can see me or another member after the service to hear more about First Parish and our Unitarian Universalist principles. If you're new and interested, you can fill out a yellow card in the rack in your pew and put it in the offertory plate, and membership coordinator Lori Hasty will contact you. Also off today, you can mail membership@firstparish.org to reach Lori Hasty. Her email is also in the order of service. Welcome to any children. I'm sure there are any children here, but even for you adults, wiggles, chortles, cries, and chirps are holy. Be who you are among us this morning. You are heard, seen, and loved. There are candles on either side of the meeting house. We invite you to lighten the weight of your burdens, fears, sorrows. Remember important anniversaries, an event or person, and life's great joys by lighting a candle during the centering hymn, the prelude, the postlude. Leave a note on the paper beside the candles to hear back from a pastoral care volunteer. We acknowledge the genocide, cruelty, and deceit used by our forebears against the Wabanaki. Our longest-serving minister, Reverend Thomas Smith, along with other prominent First Parish members, raised and profited from an expedition dispatched to kill or enslave Penobscot children, women, and men in the 1750s. To my right, over here, and in the vestibule, the entryway there's a plaque that one's in brass and one's in stone. They honor Reverend Smith. For some reason, they make no mention of his profits from the Scalp Bounty expedition. So Maine has come to be owned since by a 95% white population through a long process of oppression, land grabs, broken treaties, tearing Native children from their families, culture, and communities, and even the denial of voting rights to tribal members until 1967. We stole the land where they hunted, grew corn and beans. We dammed up the rivers and blocked the migration of fish essential to their sustainable way of life. We polluted and poisoned the water. Soon, we will hear from historian Seth Goldstein about another hard historical truth, the legacy of Maine and Portland's economic ties with African enslavement. Reverend Thomas Smith owned 3 enslaved black people, another historical fact that doesn't seem to appear on the plaques. Continuing this cheery vein, it is Memorial Day weekend. It's a time traditionally set aside to decorate the graves of fallen soldiers, our brave soldiers, not enemy soldiers, not the children killed by weapons of war. Those parades and flowers for our military dead seem practically designed to stifle any criticism and protest against the nation's long run of lost and wasteful wars during my lifetime, justified by legions of lies, perversely profiting this country's bloated military-industrial complex. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, to name just the biggest, most costly, longest-lasting wars lost by the United States in living memory. After we kill more enemy fighters and civilians, creating millions of refugees. For better or for worse, Reverend Elaine left me a proud Vietnam War resister and born-again UU, to run this Sunday's show on Memorial Day weekend. So now, with some help from the talented Richard Burbank on our Kachmar organ, let us have a moment of silence and remembrance, feet on the floor, eyes half shut, or whatever's comfortable. We breathe in peace. We breathe out love. We breathe in peace. We breathe out love. We focus thoughts not just on our dead soldiers, but also the greater number of civilians killed in war, the Texas children slaughtered with a weapon of war, the indigenous victims of our genocide, the enslaved Africans sold from their families, broken, worked to death, or hounded and cruelly punished for being free. Listen now as Richard Burbank plays Taps. Come back now from this mournful meditation, and we shall hear our prelude, a piece by Blind Thomas Wiggins, a prolific composer who was born into slavery. Now to business of keeping the lights on and paying our dedicated staff. We will hear from Bill Adams about the wonderful raffle tickets you can sell that will take the winner anywhere in the world for their own adventure.
Morning.
Misidentified. This is not Bill Adams. This is
Either,
the president of our governing board, Taryn Friedman.
I got it. Thanks. Either Bill Adams has undergone a major transformation or I am not Bill Adams. It's definitely the latter. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Taryn Friedman, and I'm your friendly neighborhood governing board president of First Parish, AKA the one with the crazy hair. So I'm here to share with you about my experience selling raffle tickets. I've had a lot of fun selling raffle tickets to my coworkers, friends, and family, and I've found it to be really easy. Most of the time, I don't even have to say what it's for. I just say, hey, would you like to participate in the most awesome raffle you could ever participate in your life? And then I hand them a postcard. As soon as they see that they can win $5,000 towards a trip anywhere in the world, many people immediately say, cool, I'm in. Or I will say, would you like to buy a raffle ticket to support my church? They usually reply with, how much is the ticket? And I say, well, let me tell you what the prizes are first. Once they find out the prizes, again, the tickets pretty much sell themselves. At this point, I have sold 41 raffle tickets. Thank you very much. I actually have 10 more for you, Bill. Would you like them now? You can come grab them. I'll take 10 more, by the way. I'm going for 50. So I'm going to keep selling raffle tickets. Thank you, Bill. Nice doing business with you.
Elaine was away. You were having a little contest with us. Mm-hmm. Leg up while she's out of time.
Exactly. Yep. Yes, Reverend Elaine and I are in a friendly competition to see who can sell the most tickets, and at the moment, I am winning. So I'm going to keep selling raffle tickets until the last possible day I can sell them, which, by the way, is June 25th, because the raffle will be drawn on the 26th, although I guess you can get some last-minute people on the morning of the 26th as well. I've sold 19 tickets to my coworkers, one of whom bought 5 tickets from me. The rest I've sold to friends and family, some of whom have bought between 2 and 5 tickets. One barrier I've noticed to selling tickets is that many people don't carry cash with them these days. I was out to dinner with 3 of my friends in Boston a couple weekends ago, and after everyone had had a drink or 2, I whipped out that postcard and made my pitch. Since no one had cash, I just said, why don't you just Venmo me for those tickets, and then I will take cash out later. So for any of you who don't know what Venmo is or how to use it, just see me later and I'll be happy to give you a tutorial. I just brought my 78-year-old mother into the 21st century and she now has Venmo on her phone. Anyway, I digress. So at dinner in Boston, my friend Dave initially bought 2 tickets, but he Venmo'd me $50. So I said, why did you Venmo me $50? It's only $40 for 2 tickets. Well, he said, I figured I would just round up and give a little extra donation. Well, without skipping a beat, I replied, well, you know, if you give me another $10, I can just give you another ticket. Just saying. I was half kidding. We all had a good laugh about it, and then Dave Venmo'd me another $10. It was a successful night. I sold 6 tickets to 3 friends, not too shabby. So for all of you who do not end up seeing people in person very often, I think that you can sell tickets in some different ways. I had some thoughts about that. So maybe you could consider sending an email to all of your friends and family telling them about the raffle. You could tell them that they can Venmo you money, and then you can mail them a ticket or snap a picture of their ticket and text it to them and hang on to the hard copy yourself. I don't know. Maybe is that kosher, Bill? That'd be kosher. You could also put a post on Facebook about the raffle. I think people have had success with that in the past. To gain some interest. That's something I actually haven't done yet, so I think I'm going to do that today. On a serious note, First Parish really needs this fundraiser to be successful. The success of this raffle will make or break our budget for this fiscal year. As the governing board president, I see the monthly financial reports every single month, and every month I get little knots in my stomach worrying about, are we going to end up with a balanced budget or not? I better sell some more tickets. So, I'm encouraging all of you to put your sassy, fundraising, big person pants on and get out there and sell some more tickets. If you are a member and you've already sold 10 tickets, I'm going to challenge you to pick up 10 or 15 more. If you are friends of First Parish and you have not considered participating in the raffle, we would really appreciate your help with selling these tickets. Please consider picking up 5 or 10 tickets to sell. And if you are coming here for the first time today, please consider buying 1 ticket for yourself after the service. Bill Adams, our fearless and dedicated raffle organizer, has the raffle ticket table set up in the next room over there. You never know, you might just buy the winning ticket. Thank you very much.
Taryn, could you help us light the chalice?
Absolutely.
As in you congregations around the world, we now light this chalice as a symbol of our compassion and our commitment to justice and the truth. And please recite with me the chalice lighting covenant that's in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is our covenant, and service is our prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek truth in love, and to help one another to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine.
Normally, the time for all ages is a book with people reading to children, but there have not been many children around lately, and we couldn't find a book that was appropriate because they were too long. So our topic this morning, to supplement or introduce Seth Goldstein's address to us, is this topic, the Underground Railroad. So, what do you know about the Underground Railroad? That's what we want to talk about. Angus has already told us something about who participated. Our pastor, thank you. And then let's reflect on what does this mean for us today? What can we learn from this vast movement? Who of you has a story, something you remember from your family? I can remember my grandparents talking about the Underground Railroad. They talked about it often. Now, these were folks descended from farmers in Ohio. They were Taft Republicans. But they talked about the movement incidentally, but quite often. So as a little kid, I tended to learn a lot about it. I don't remember if any of our family members were directly involved. I just know that for these conservative Ohio people, it had been an important event in their parents' lives that had preceded them. What about the rest of you? Do you have any stories? I'd like you to tell the story. Anyone? Anyone?
This is not about my family, but I grew up on the coast of Massachusetts, and there was a house in town, belonged to some of my friends, and it had a secret cellar with a secret staircase leading down to it. And I don't know for sure, but the legend was that had been used to hide slaves who had taken boats up the coast to escape and were headed for Canada. It also came in handy later on during Prohibition to hide the rum.
Thank you, Pat. Anyone else? Do you remember anything about it? Well, it was a vast network. It was supposedly largely secret, underground. And then someone, I don't know who it was, maybe Seth can tell us, compared it to a railroad with conductors and trains, but it was secret. And then apparently it was not exactly so secret, because some events were public, and the abolitionists, of course, were heavily involved. But it was largely the black community who conducted this and arranged it. It's quite amazing how many people were involved. It was a vast movement. It's been estimated. Yes, Carolyn, you've got a story. Carolyn. Come up here, talk loud.
All right, so I used to live up on Monjo Hill, and around the corner from my house, there was a plaque saying a barber shop used to be here. And it was part of the Underground Railroad, when people would get messages to each other through the barber shop, and more pointedly, they could give people disguises, change their hair, change their appearances as a way to help people escape to freedom. And I thought that was fascinating, that, the role of the barber, like the individuals who just stood up and used what they could to be of service. So I thought that was a really interesting idea about how different people showed up in different ways to help these people survive. So,
yes, thank you, Carolyn. We had a number of free black families that always lived here in Portland, and they were clustered down around India Street now, where our very first church was erected, right down on the harbor in 1727. When the Reverend Thomas Smith, the guy on the plaque here, was called to be the town pastor and doctor. He was also trained as a doctor, and he was also a very good real estate speculator and made a lot of money that way, and then had the privilege of being the agent for the colonial government to organize scouting and cruising parties to go off and scalp the Wabanaki people. He was the pastor of our church, so it's interesting who participated. But the free black community, and Seth is going to tell us more about that, a large number of them were mariners. So they were seamen, and so they were privileged to know about these people who had escaped from wherever they came from, to hide them, and as Carolyn said, disguise them. They would come in to the port here, and these mariners would take care of changing their appearance and then whisking them away so that they could slowly make their way up to Canada, which had no restrictions for them, so that's where they were bound. So there was a network of hidden places and ways for them. It was a movement run by the black community with white allies, and it's pretty amazing. I think my family said that they had said that their parent, my grandmother and grandfather, that their parents had sheltered some of these stowaway people. There's all kind of myths and legends that arose from this, and you've heard of some of them. It was even believed that quilts hung out on the line to dry had messages on them. That's largely been challenged and disproven, but it's still. But we have to be careful in this that we don't make it a white savior story. And that's what I wanted to speak about now. We white people, we were the allies in that movement. So we'll learn more about this, but I just wanted to leave you with one question, and I hope you will respond. What does this mean for us today? You know, we're in a very difficult situation in our nation now. What did this vast movement, what does it tell you? Well, for me, it means if we collaborate and we work together for a moral purpose, for the common good, we can quietly but purposefully and gradually change the world. So let's use that, the Underground Railroad, to help us. And by the way, Colson Whitehead's novel, The Underground Railroad, is well worth a read for you. It's an amazing book. He takes the railroad and makes a metaphor out of it for the Black community's progress through the stages of white supremacy. And it's pretty amazing, so I recommend it. Anything else? Any comment anyone wants to make? Jay.
Hi, my name is Jake Kula. I'm also a member of the governing board here. And I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York, which was another very vast part of that network, very close to Canada. So I heard about it in school, and Harriet Tubman, and I was like, oh, that lady's cool, right? And I guess want to say to your question about what's happening today, I think together we're stronger, and I think we need to have some conversations which may be uncomfortable, but that's okay. For me, I want to speak specifically about adopting the 8th principle, which has gotten a little bit of resistance. And then, so we have to ask ourselves why. Why do we not want to stand up as the UU Church against some of us, not all of us? What's the resistance? And just like the rest of the country, what's the resistance of standing together and standing with each other rather than the divisiveness? So, and I think the UU is capable of doing it. I think the First Parish is capable of doing it. And we lead with love.
Thank you, Jay. So keep hope alive and think about the Underground Railroad.
Come back June 19th when a service will feature Pam Cummings, who's president of the board of the Abyssinian Meeting House, which is the free Black church that was central to the Underground Railroad here in Portland. It's now my honor to introduce Seth Goldstein, who's a history instructor at the Maine College of Art and Design. I also learned he just has taken a position leading the Cushing Museum in South Portland. He's also educational director at the Atlantic Black Box. I first met Seth last fall when he gave a tour of Portland's Freedom Trail, and he talked about the less often told history of ordinary people. He's a great storyteller. I give you Seth Goldstein.
Thanks so much, Angus. I appreciate it. I just want to start by saying that I am honored to be here. I am grateful to be here. I am humbled to be here in front of you today to share some of what I've learned over the last 5 or 6 years of doing historical research in the greater Portland area. And I take no ownership over this history. I just look forward to sharing it with people. And you know, some of this is uncomfortable, and it should be uncomfortable. We should be uncomfortable with some of this historical legacy, and we should sit with that discomfort. So the West Indies trade is what I'll be discussing today. It was a big part of the economics of greater Portland historically. There was a book published in 1948, Maritime History of Maine, and I'm a maritime historian, so I've studied maritime history my whole life. Pirates, lighthouses, New England whalers, things of that nature. So this book, Maine Maritime History, published in 1948, written by William Hutchinson Rowe. Chapter 6, a chapter titled The West India Trade. And here I quote from chapter 6, where the author says, regardless of what was to be a Maine boy's occupation or profession, an indispensable part of his upbringing was a voyage or two in the West India trade. And quote there, and I'll tell you all about the West India trade in just a moment. But so for young men in Maine, this was an opportunity to see some of the world and to, quote, sow their royal oats before they settled down to whatever profession or trade that they were going to do for the rest of their life. They would take a voyage in their young manhood to the West Indies. So the author has this entire chapter about the West Indies trade, discussing goods that were traded from Portland and Maine to the West Indies and what we received from the West Indies. And I'll tell you that in this entire chapter, the author does not once mention the labor of enslaved Africans, the engine that was generating all of this trade. Not one mention of the labor of enslaved Africans. So as I said, I'm a maritime historian. I have studied New England maritime history my entire life. And to me, this is a metaphor for New England's maritime history and how we look at it, right? The place of enslaved Africans and New England's relationship to the economics of enslavement has been purposely erased from this historical narrative. And so we at the Atlantic Black Box, for which I am the educational coordinator, our mission as a grassroots organization is to bring up this purposely hidden history, to share marginalized history of the economics of the people of color who lived here in Maine and New England. So we'll advance the slide here. And so here we see, this is a really striking picture. This was from Stedman's book about Suriname. Suriname, a Dutch colony that was in South America, where enslaved Africans grew luxury commodities such as sugar and chocolate and tobacco. And so the title of this image is Europe Supported by Africa and America. So empires like Great Britain overlooked the horror of slavery in the name of financial gains and national power. These Atlantic systems, as they were called, rely on labor from Africa and land in the Americas to generate wealth for European nations. The first cargo of enslaved Africans that come to North America, as many of you know, arrives in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. So here we see a map of, maybe this was called the triangle trade when you were in school, or maybe it was the Atlantic world economy. The term that I use is the Atlantic world slave economy. And this is to remind everyone that it's really the labor of enslaved Africans that's generating all of the wealth in the Atlantic world. And this starts with Columbus, his second voyage in the late 1400s, and goes all the way up until the late 1800s. Slavery is legal on the island of Cuba until 1886, which historically is not that long ago, really just a drop in the bucket. And so here we see all the various commodities, Maine at the center of this image here. You can see English finished goods going to Europe, right? Mast logs, which is a fascinating part of Maine's history, the mast trade. But if we look at what's going to the West Indies, and in this image, because this is early in the colonial period, much of this is going to Barbados, we see molasses, sugar, and rum being shipped from the West Indies to Maine. And we see being shipped from Maine to the West Indies, it says red oak staves, lumber, and fish. So a stave is part of a cask. And we think of barrels today. A barrel actually is a size of cask. And so casks were very important historically. It was the shipping container that everything was shipped in. Dry goods, wet goods, salt cod, mackerel, apples, rum are all shipped in casks. And so they would ship these casks to the West Indies to be filled with molasses and sugar. So here we see some images of sugar production in the West Indies. Now, sugar plantations are considered the first industrial production centers. It combines both aspects of agricultural and factory work. So in some of these images, we can see enslaved Africans working the sugarcane fields. We see a sugar press that they would feed the sugarcane into to produce sugar juice. And we also see another sugar press where they're using oxen to turn the press once again to press the sugar cane into a sugar juice. So work in both the mills and boiling house was unpleasant and dangerous. The work was exhausting and led to horrific accidents. A slave with a machete stood beside the slave who fed the cane into the mill, ready to cut off the arm of the mill feeder in case it became trapped. Sir Thomas Lynch wrote in 1672 that, quote, plantations are subject to an abundance of ill accidents, especially sugar works, because they have so many machines. Contemporary writers record some of the hazards, and here I quote, if a mill feeder be catched by the finger, his whole body is drawn in and is squeezed to pieces. If a boiler gets part into the scalding sugar, it sticks like glue or bird lime, and 'tis hard to save either limb or life. So some of the dangers of working in these sugar factories. So here we see, this is a ledger from Nathaniel Knight, circa 1734. This is in the possession of the Maine Historical Society. Now, Knight was the right-hand man of Colonel Thomas Westbrook, of whom Westbrook is named after. He served as the masked agent to the Crown with his partner Samuel Waldo, who Waldoboro is named after. And so you can see here in this ledger from 1734, I've added some arrows. And they're using some very creative spelling here, but we can still decipher it. So this is goods that were owed to men who worked in the mass trade, is what we see in the ledger here. So the first arrow there, it says to sugar and cotton. Below that, once again, sugar. Third arrow down, very creative spelling of tobacco, or in this case, tobacco. Right? Below that, sugar. And finally, the final arrow, molasses and tobacco. So it gives us an idea of the importance of these luxury goods in trade going way, way back to 1734. So here we see, this is the burning of Cap Francis, Saint-Domingue, 1793. Starting in 1791, the slaves of Saint-Domingue rebelled against their French owners. After years of fighting, the formerly enslaved Africans won their freedom and established the hemisphere's second independent nation, Haiti. Saint-Domingue had been a major source of molasses and sugar for Maine and Portland. Following the revolution, trade shifts to the island of Cuba. And so, once again, this is a painting that's in the possession of the Maine Historical Society here in Portland, and it was done by a Maine-based artist who went to Cuba to paint this scene. And so here we see painting of sugarcane harvesting and transportation in Cuba, 1873. So this is a testament to the close connection between Portland, Maine, and Cuba. Slavery is legal in Cuba, as I said, until 1886. The average life of an enslaved African once they reached Cuba, and many did not survive the Middle Passage, about a fifth of the enslaved Africans perished during the Middle Passage, but for those of them that made it to Cuba, the average life expectancy on a plantation was 7 years. 7 years. Because the plantation owners conducted a brutally inhumane calculation that it was more profitable to bring in new enslaved Africans than it was to properly care and feed for the enslaved Africans already on the plantations. 7-year life expectancy. Portland's first sugar house is opened in 1845 and becomes a major industry in Portland. So once again, a letter in the possession of the Maine Historical Society to Portland resident Elizabeth Montford. This is from a friend traveling in Trinidad, Cuba, and because Cuba was our #1 trade partner, people from Portland traveled frequently to Cuba, sometimes owned plantations in Cuba, and so they would travel there to look after their interests. And so here we have a letter to Portland resident Elizabeth Montford, in which the author states, "To Elizabeth, I should like to spend some time in the country." So here she is, she's in the city of Trinidad. She'd like to spend some time in the country were it not for the shrieks of the slaves, which you hear constantly, someone or another being nearly all the time at the whipping post. And this was a photograph taken by my friend Linda Ash Ford, who recently traveled to Cuba. So here's a letter to the owner of the Bark Eagle, once again in the possession of the Maine Historical Society. And here I quote from the Maine Memory Network the description that accompanies this image. This account is directed to the owners of the ship Eagle, which included Thomas Robeson of Portland, Maine. As a participant in the triangle trade, Robeson used sugar and molasses from the West Indies to produce rum in his distill house, located on his wharf at the foot of Ann, today Park Street, in Portland. Rum from New England was often shipped to Africa, where ship captains would collect a cargo of slaves before sailing to the West Indies. So what we have here is molasses produced by enslaved African in the West Indies. That molasses then shipped here to Portland, Maine, where it's distilled into rum, which is then shipped to the west coast of Africa to purchase more enslaved Africans for the plantations in the West Indies. In 1791, Spain's King Charles IV had recently opened the port of Havana, Cuba to foreign trade. The Eagle's captain, Henry Skinner, took advantage of this trade opportunity by purchasing goods and services in Havana after selling 13 slaves from Africa. So he was a slave runner. Most of the proceeds from the sales were put towards the purchase of sugar. Other expenses show the cost of feeding, clothing, and transporting human cargo. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we'll all remember that Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts outlawed the slave trade in 1787, and the Eagle's slaving voyage was unlawful. As a result, the Eagle's captain, Henry Skinner, and Robeson's agent, Thomas Hodges, were taken to court in Portland in 1792. According to a footnote on page 28 of William Willis's History of Portland, published in 1831, Skinner and all were fined 200 pounds for fitting out the ship and 50 pounds each for the 13 slaves sold. Once again, that's a quote from the Maine Memory Network. And so here we see a map of Portland, and here I'll quote from a wonderful book called Creating Portland that has a series of essays in it about Portland history. This particular essay was titled Portland as Commercial Center, and it's by Charles P.M. Outwin. And he says, I quote, Jedediah Preble, Enoch Isley, and his younger brother Daniel Simon Mayo and John Waite, 5 of the foremost merchants in Falmouth, together invested in the construction of a large distillery on its own wharf at the far northeastern end of 4th Street. In spite of local interference due to alcohol-related criminality, this operation, overseen by Daniel Isley, was producing enough rum by 1774 to meet substantial regional demands. To be sure, Fiddle Lane, now known as the Franklin Arterial, was laid out in 1756 and became infamous for its watering holes, frequented by laborers and sailors on shore leave in their brief periods of leisure. So we have all this molasses that's coming up from the West Indies, much of it going to these distill houses on the Portland waterfront and producing rum. So 1787, 73 of the 89 ships that depart from Portland Harbor are bound for the West Indies. Right? 73 out of 89, indicating the importance of the trade in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Following the repeal of the 1824 molasses tax, it became cheaper to produce rum in Portland than to import it from the West Indies. Hence, Portland had seven rum distilleries along its waterfront in the early 19th century. And so, surprising, because we think of rum as a product of the West Indies, but so much rum was being produced here in Portland. And even still today, you see to the left there a picture of Screech rum, which is rum that's still produced in Newfoundland that you could purchase today. And so, once again, I'm going to quote here. This is from another essay from that great book, Creating Portland. This essay was titled Comunidad Escondida, Latin American Influence in 19th and 20th Century Portland, David Carey Jr., and he says, I quote, "For much of the 19th century, Portland was a major entrepot of international commerce. At a time when Cuba was the United States' third largest trading partner, Portland was one of the major ports in this exchange, and Maine ships were among the most common vessels trafficking in the West Indies. Ships loaded with lumber, bricks, and ice set sail for the Caribbean islands and returned with sugar, molasses, rum, and goods to stock local grocery stores. The wealth generated in this trade affected Portland's physical environment, from landfill extended wharfs to the large homes that remain central to Portland's identity today. The Portland bricks that dot the streets of Trinidad, Cuba, are symbolic of the intricate relations between Portland and Latin America. And here we see a picture that was taken a couple years ago. Trinidad, Cuba. The streets still today lined with the ballast stones of Maine ships as a testament to this close relationship between Cuba and Portland and Maine. I'll stop here and I'll continue with my presentation in just a few minutes.
How about this one? Okay, better. Our meditation today is a poem by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Mrs. Harper was born a free African-American woman in 1825. She published her first book of poetry at age 20. All of her life, she was a poet, she was a writer, she was a teacher. She was one of the first African-American women to be published in the United States. And she dedicated her life to the abolitionist cause, to
seeking freedom for her comrades in slavery, and later to pushing the women's suffrage movement to also advocate for the vote for African American women. In this poem, called The Slave Auction, she evokes the emotions of people who were pawns in the economic system that Mr. Goldstein has been describing. The sale began. Young girls were there, defenseless in their wretchedness, whose stifled sobs of deep despair revealed their anguish and distress. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries when tyrants bartered them for gold. And woman, with her love and truth, for these in sable forms may dwell, gazed on the husband of her youth with anguish none may paint or tell. And men whose sole crime was their hue, the impress of their maker's hand, and frail and shrinking children, too, were gathered in that mournful band. You who have laid your loved to rest and wept above their lifeless clay, know not the anguish of that breast whose loved are rudely torn away. You may not know how desolate our bosoms rudely forced to part, and how a dull and heavy weight will press the life drops from the heart. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper died in 1911, and her funeral was held at the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia.
You may remain seated while we sing our centering hymn, Spirit of Life. That's hymn number 123 in your hymnal.
Stirrings of compassion blow in the wind, rising the sea, moving the land, making life the shade of justice. Whose hold me close, may set me free. Spirit of love, come to me, come to me.
I guess Seth Goldstein will now resume.
Okay. So here we see the largest building on the Portland waterfront in the 19th century. It was the John Bundy Brown Sugar Refinery. This building stood close to where the Portland Pie Pizza Company now stands. There's a warehouse building. Burns to the ground during the Great Fire of 1866, as does 2/3 of the city of Portland. Rebuilt, but never as successful as it was in the 1850s and 1860s. So Portland imported 3 times as much molasses as Boston. And the Portland Sugar Works was processing 200 hogshead. A hogshead is a 63-gallon cask. 200 hogshead of molasses a day. By 1855, the business employs between 150 and 200 workers. 10 years later, almost 1,000 individuals working at this sugar refinery here in Portland. Many of them Irish immigrants, by the way. At this time, 1860, 20% of all the molasses in the United States was processed right here in Portland, Maine. Now, this constitutes more than any other city in the United States. We're processing the most molasses here in Portland of any city in the United States. Of course, all of this molasses grown by enslaved Africans. And so here we see some lumberjacks and a thing of molasses. The farms and lumber camps of northern New England, including Vermont and New Hampshire, produced food and lumber for the sugar plantations. In fact, the sugar is so profitable that the island of Cuba, they're only growing sugar exclusively. It's a monoculture. They've cut down all their forests. They're not growing their own foodstuffs, right? And so it's Maine that produces the lumber that builds the plantation, and it's Maine that provides the food that feeds the enslaved Africans, and then, of course, purchases the molasses. So goods are shipped back and forth between the hinterland and Portland using a system of canals that are built in the 1800s. The most famous of these canal systems is the Cumberland-Oxford Canal, completed in 1830. Now, today, if you go to the Nickelodeon movie theater and you look across the street, you'll see a building called the Canal Bank Building, right? It says right on the building, Canal Bank, because this bank was capitalized to create the money to build this canal to connect the interior of Maine with the entrepot, or the main port of Portland. So, according to Rose, Maritime History of Maine, during one winter, a country store in Pittston disposed of 90 hogsheads, once again, a 63-gallon cask, 90 hogsheads of rum. A boatman on the Cumberland and Oxford Canal reported that during the season, he alone delivered 300 barrels of 42-gallon cask, in case you were curious, to the towns along his route. So large quantities of rum and large quantities of molasses going into the interior, because we probably are not too surprised to find out that lumberjacks really enjoy drinking rum, particularly in the winter, and they would have used molasses to sweeten their food, because this is before refrigeration, and your food most often tasted horrible, so you would have wanted to have sweetened it. So working class people used molasses to sweeten their food. But if you were a rich, well-to-do Portlander, you would have an ornate sugar bowl on your dining room table. And in fact, I've been working with the Portland Museum of Art to help them update their collection and the interpretation of their collection. Recently, I found out they have 82 ornate sugar bowls in their collection, the Portland Museum of Art. Because, as I said, if you were a well-to-do merchant, this is how you would have impressed your guests. You would have had somebody over, and you would have had this ornate sugar bowl on your dining room table, and you would have said something like, "Oh, can I offer you a little refined white sugar with your tea?" And that's how people knew you were fancy pants, right? Refined white sugar. In fact, there was just an exhibit at the Maine Historical Society called Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine. And of course, one of the artifacts they had were one of these sugar bowls. In fact, that one that you see in the picture right there. So the white sugar would have been pressed into cones, like you see here, and then you would have used sugar nips, as you see on the far left there, to kind of cut off a little chunk off of that cone of sugar so that you could have it in your tea. And this is, once again, if you were a well-to-do merchant in Portland, you would have used this refined white sugar that was produced at the sugar refinery that I showed you just earlier. So this is John Bundy Brown. John Bundy Brown begins his Portland, Maine career in the wholesale grocery business. His career later branches into the sugar and molasses, and he's the gentleman who builds the Portland Sugar Company refinery, that 7-story building that I showed you just a couple minutes ago that employs 1,000 individuals by the 1860s. So, very successful venture, which he involves his oldest son, Philip Henry Brown. The Portland Sugar Company, once again, burns to the ground in the Great Fire of 1866 and never fully recovers. His other ventures include railroads and hotels, and after his death, he leaves behind a wealthy estate of which his son Philip Henry Brown and John Marshall Brown, the sons of J.B. Brown and Sons, were the executors. Brown's contribution to the architectural history of Portland include his home on the Western Promenade, Brom Hill, and also the J.B. Brown block. So here we see J.B. Brown's palatial mansion, which he builds in 1858 with the proceeds from his sugar business. Builds it on the Western Prom. Now, this building no longer exists. It burned to the ground, I believe, in the early 1900s, as many large wooden buildings often do. But he sells off the plots of land to his other well-to-do merchant friends who are also making their money in this West Indies trade. And so today, when one goes to the Western Prom to admire those beautiful Victorian homes, likewise, the Eastern Prom, the majority of those buildings that are so central to the identity of Portland were built from the proceeds of this West Indies trade and hence connected to the labor of enslaved Africans. So here we see a building. This is right across the street from where I teach at the Maine College of Art and Design. This is the J.B. Brown building. And if you look very closely at the building, a terracotta tile over the front door, you see J.B. Brown's signature over the door of this building. J.B. Brown Building, Congress Street, built by his sons, Philip Henry and John Marshall, in the years 1882 to 1883 to honor their late father. The company today still involved with commercial real estate in the city. In fact, in 2020, they developed 51 residential units and a retail space at 40 Free Street. The website describes the company. This is their website, by the way. Their website still describes the company as, quote, still family owned. So think about that for a second, right? The wealth that this family generated in the sugar trade, right, is still helping them today. It's a testament to this white generational wealth and its influence and how it impacts people for generations and generations. This is the Safford House at 93 High Street. Today, it's the headquarters of Greater Portland Landmarks, which is a wonderful organization I've had the pleasure to work with in the past. Although Greater Portland Landmarks recently announced their intent to sell the building. It was built by merchant William Safford in 1858. He made much of his money through the importation of molasses from Cuba. Safford had an office in Cardenas, Cuba, where he frequently journeyed to conduct his business. In fact, one of his children, his daughter, Inez, was born in Cardenas in 1848. So once again, a testament to this close relationship between Portland and Cuba and how merchants would go to Cuba to look after their sugar interests and a lot of times would own the plantations and the vessels that would ship the molasses here to Portland. And so once again, I'll quote from Comunidad Escondida. And so David Carey Jr. says, quote, by the late 1820s, Cuba had become the world's largest sugar producer, and most of it was going to the United States and England. Concurrently, Maine supplied Cuban planters with the salt fish to feed their slaves, and Portland was Maine's fish export center. By selling the food that sustained them and consuming what they produced, Maine's major port became a primary beneficiary of Cuban slaves' labor. Maine's historical relationship with slavery is complex. Its collaboration with Cuban slavery contradicts its stance against domestic slavery. Portland entrepreneurs who feasted on Cuban sugar stood in stark contrast to Maine's abolitionist movement and the state's contribution of troops to fight the South in the Civil War. Paradoxically, Portlanders were structurally involved in slavery abroad, yet intolerant of it on their own soil. This cognitive dissonance, I love that term, this cognitive dissonance, right? They just didn't want to think about it. This cognitive dissonance reveals moral standards that were malleable in the face of profits and comforts. So here we see the codfish, and I'm a maritime historian, so I study the historic North Atlantic fishery quite a bit. The codfish, so important that the gentleman wrote a book called Cod, the biography of the fish that changed the world, right? One of the most important fish species in human history, and that's because its flaky white meat lent itself to being preserved by salting, critically important before refrigeration. So this is the protein that is most easily preserved before refrigeration, salt cod. Cod is a very lean flesh, and so it doesn't have a lot of fat. Fat is the enemy of preservation, and so cod takes this preservation process better than any other protein known to man before refrigeration, and so it is the cheapest protein available before refrigeration, and hence large quantities of salt cod sent to the West Indies, where it feeds the enslaved Africans. So cod used to grow to impressive size. You can see here, fish 6 feet in length and weighing over 211 pounds, caught off the coast of Massachusetts in 1895. Once again, 1895 is not even historically that long ago. I share this information with a lot of different groups when I'm doing lectures. How big of a fish is that? Right, 6 feet in length, 211 pounds. So look at this guy. I'm 6 foot tall. I'm like 214, 5, you know, right around there. So we're talking about codfish the size of this guy is what they were catching historically. Now, I tell my college students about times before refrigeration, and I can almost literally see their heads explode, because they can't imagine a time before cell phones, let alone a time before refrigerators, right? But yes, before refrigeration, which comes around about 1900, all of your food had to be pickled or salted or in some way preserved. And that's why salt cod is so important to the global economy, and especially the economy of New England. So important, in fact, that a wooden codfish hung from the ceiling of the old State House in Boston. And guess what? That wooden codfish still hangs in the State House in Boston today, because it was the linchpin of the colonial and post-colonial economy here in New England. And so here we see a wonderful image. In fact, this was taken behind Harbor Fish. Of course, Harbor Fish wasn't there in 1882, but if you go down there today, you'll see a very similar situation with the fishing boats docked right up there today. The catch comes right off the boats and goes right into Harbor Fish. This is that exact location. And so this is the fishing fleet here in Portland in 1882. And this is what's known as a flake yard. And so a flake yard is where they would have taken these fillets of cod that had been salted, and they would put them on these big tables that you see here in this image to dry in the sun. And it would take a couple of days for the salted cod to become salt cod. And for those of you who have seen salt cod, you know it's hard as a board. It's very easy to transport. It needs to be rehydrated and reconstituted to be edible. But if you look in this picture here, you'll see each one of these individual white objects on these tables is a single fillet of cod that's been salted and left in the sun to cure. And once again, this is a view of the flake yard. So, I mean, just look at that flake. It gives you an idea of the scale of the industry, right? It's a huge, huge area on the Portland waterfront that's devoted to the production of the salt cod. Another major contribution to the trade between Portland and the West Indies was lumber. Because much of Cuba's forest had been burned down to make room for sugar plantation, Maine supplied much of the lumber for building. In fact, the port of Matanzas in Cuba built almost entirely out of New England lumber. Maine also supplies many of the boxes and casks that sugar and molasses are shipped in. So here we see, this is, next slide, please. So you can see here, these are the many different sizes of cask. And so today we say barrel, but a barrel is really a size of cask, right? And so you have a tune, a very large cask. You can see a butt cask, a hogshead, a barrel, a tierce, all sizes of casks. And as I said previously, everything during this period is shipped in casks, whether it's dry goods or wet goods. And so what they would do is they would ship the casks broken down to save space to the West Indies, so into staves, hoops, and headers, and they would then be assembled in Cuba once they got there. So many small sawmills were busy sawing and fitting the box boards to proper lengths, all ready to be set up and nailed on the sugar plantation. The cooper's trade, cooper is somebody who makes barrels, the cooper's trade in the manufacture of hogshead and tierce shoots was one of the best paid in the towns near the coast. In 1867, there were 263 such shops in the state. So 263 cooperages in the state of Maine. As been explained, the shook was a package of red oak staves and heading, numbered, and ready to be set up as a hogshead or tierce or cask when needed. This was done by the coopers on the plantations or by state of Maine coopers who went out to the islands for that purpose. So what you have here are coopers from Portland who are going to Cuba to assemble these barrels. And they would do that in the winter, which was their quiet season up here. So in the winter, they would go to Cuba to assemble these casks so that molasses and sugar could be packed in them, and that could be shipped up here. Once again, this is that chapter, Trade with the West Indies by Rowe, makes no mention of enslaved labor in the entire chapter. And I quote here, "Then also there were house frames, all ready to put up, oxen and horses for the plow," so draft animals that they would have needed to work the plantations, the sugar and treadmill, farm produce such as parsnips, potatoes, onions, and grain, beef, mutton, pork, pickled fish, soap, candles, and dried codfish in drums of from 500 to 800 pounds each, lumber from the banks of Maine rivers, which cost there $8 a thousand, sold in Havana for $60. Beets and parsnips brought $16 a barrel in the French islands. So that would be Martinique, would be one of the French islands where there was slave labor, for example. And then this is finally what I'll leave you here today with. This is not my area of expertise, but at the Atlantic Black Box, I work with Dr. Kate McMahon, who's from Maine and now works for the Smithsonian for the Center for the Study of Global Slavery. And Kate has done extensive research on Maine vessels that participated in the slave trade. If you're interested in this topic, you can visit the website atlanticblackbox.com, where we have links to Kate's work. Kate's work is groundbreaking, and she lectures frequently here in Maine and beyond. But what we see here is, this is the execution of Gordon the slave trader, an image that was published in Harper's Weekly March 8, 1862. So this guy, Nathaniel Gordon, he's from Portland, Maine. He's the only individual ever hung for the piratical act of being involved in the slave trade. And it's deemed a piratical act in 1820 by the government, right? So piratical act, punishable by hanging. Now, lots of people are caught doing this, but they abscond, they have a rich friend, they pay off the judge, the jailer leaves the door open, right? The only person who's ever prosecuted to the letter of the law for this piratical act of being involved in the slave trade is one Nathan Gordon, who's caught off the coast of Africa in 1860 with 897 enslaved Africans crammed below deck, half of whom are children. They're packed so tightly in the slaving vessel that Gordon has to show the U.S. sailors aboard the Mohican, which is the U.S. naval vessel that captures him. He has to show the sailors how to make the enslaved Africans sit so that they can all be packed on the ship together, where they are shipped to Liberia and offered their freedom. But it gives you an idea of how tightly packed together they were on his vessel. So he's hung in New York City in 1862, the only individual ever hung for this piratical act of slave trading from Portland, Maine. So that's my presentation for you today. Thank you for listening to some of this history, and I'd be happy to answer any questions after the service. Thank you very much.
So
Yep, okay, here we go. Now it is time for the ushers to come among you to accept donations if you are able, which will help to support this building, our staff, the work of this church. And for the offertory, we will have some spirited music.
You know, we always wonder what we can do in the face of all these atrocities that are going on around the world. And I think one of the worst things we can do is just be silent. And so this is a Bob Dylan song called Ring Those Bells. Ring them bells, ye heathen, from the city that dreams. Ring them bells from the sanctuaries, across the valleys and streams. For they're deep and they're wide, and the world's on its side, and time is running backwards, and so is the bride. Ring them bells, St. Peter, where the four winds blow. Ring them bells with an iron hand so the people will know. Oh, it's rush hour now on the wheel and the plow, and the sun is going down upon the sacred cow. Ring them bells, sweet Martha, for the poor man's son. Ring them bells so the world will know God is one. Oh, the shepherd's asleep, and the willows weep, and the mountains filled with lost sheep. Ring them bells for the blind and the deaf. Ring them bells for all of us who are left. Ring them bells for the chosen few who'll judge the many when the game is through. Ring them bells for the time that flies, for the child that cries when innocence dies. Ring them bells, St. Catherine, from the top of the room. Ring them from the fortress for the lilies that bloom. Oh, the lines are long and the fighting is strong, and they're breaking down the distance between right and wrong. Ring them bells, ring them bells, ring them bells, ooh, ring those bells. Ring them bells, ring them bells, ring them bells, ooh, ring them bells.
Dina Hastings and Bob Fowler, thank you very much. So some would condemn what we learned here today as critical race theory. History is as biased as memory, it's selective, it's fading, easily tricked. We tend to absorb and tell stories that jibe with our identity and prejudices. In my days, in the 1950s, Cape Elizabeth sixth graders got to see Gone with the Wind as a Civil War history lesson. W.E. Du Bois slammed the history textbooks of 1935 that taught abolitionists ruined any hope of ending slavery peacefully. Harriet Beecher Stowe ignited the Civil War by publishing Uncle Tom's Cabin. The promise of equal rights in the 14th Amendment was exploited by Northern carpetbaggers and resulted in a Reconstruction that disgraced and subjected white people to ignorant Negro rule until the Ku Klux Klan rode to the rescue. W.B. Du Bois concluded, the facts of American history have been falsified because the nation was ashamed. Taught in a few law schools 40 years ago, critical race theory argued that racism is a structure built over time, not simply a prejudice existing in individual minds. Racism does persist in our minds as implicit bias of not overt or dog whistle racial hatred. But racism is also embedded in the land taken by genocide and the real estate built and capitalized over decades from our historic trade with sugar plantations. It's a spiritual cliche that's with some truth, that the past is history, tomorrow is a mystery, be here, present, and today. But we learned another lesson today, thanks to Seth Goldstein and Chris Minster, Dina Hastings, Bob Fowler, Pat Washburn. History sets the stage for life today. It's built in the walls, covered up by misleading plaques, favoring the fortunate with gains multiplying ill-gotten profits by forebearers, guilty of genocide and complicity in slavery. To quote Hilary Mantel, history is not the past. It is a method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. Please join me now in our unison benediction as I extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of the warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. We'll now have the postlude, again by Dina Hastings and Bob Fowler. Amazing Grace was written by an English clergyman, John Newton, who in his younger days sailed on ships in the slave trade.